Hey, everybody. If you watch the news on Taiwan lately, you'll almost certainly have heard two terms used, and you'll probably have heard them used incorrectly. Those are the One China principle and the One China policy. So I thought it would be worth a few minutes to talk about the difference. First and foremost, the One China principle is China's talking point, and the One China policy is a description of US policy on China and Taiwan. So when the United States recognized the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, and de recognized the Republic of China, or ROC, now Taiwan, in 1979, the US government under Jimmy Carter stated that the Chinese Communist Party was the sole legal government of China, meaning that the PRC was the only China, and we did not consider Taiwan as a separate sovereign state. But there is an important caveat there. At the same time, the United States did not recognize Beijing as holding sovereignty over Taiwan. Now, in the language used by the US, Washington acknowledges that the Chinese position that Taiwan was part of China. So it's basically like a married couple fighting. So you agree with me? No, I agree that that is your opinion. The US agrees that it is Beijing's opinion that they have sovereignty over Taiwan. We do not recognize it. And China sort of went with that, agreeing to disagree because both sides could sort of take advantage of this linguistic loophole and go home and say that they won a grand diplomatic victory. Now, it's worked out very well until recent years, in which actions on both sides have challenged that status quo and made things a bit more unsteady. Now, China still looks at it as if there were one China and Taiwan is part of China's territory, and that the government in Beijing represents both. And to back that up, they cite UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, which was passed in 1971. I won't read it here, but I will link it in the show notes if you want to go back and check the text yourself. So, to put it simply, China's one China principle, in their minds, means that there is one China, one government of China, and Taiwan is part of China. The US One China policy agrees that there is one China and acknowledges that Beijing thinks that it owns Taiwan. However, the US reserves the right to interact with Taiwan as a separate entity, however, not as a sovereign, independent state. So, underlying this whole thing is something that I like to talk about, which are the three communiques. And you'll hear this if you hear about, you start looking into China Taiwan, you'll hear a lot about the three communiques and six assurances. And we're going to get to both of those. So, between 1972 and 1982, the United States and the PRC agreed to three joint communiques, each of which referred to Taiwan in one way or another. The first, the joint US China communique, was issued at Shanghai in 1972 between President Nixon and Zhou Enlai. Number two, the joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, 1st of Jan 1979, and the joint US China communique, August 17, 1982. Again, I'm not going to read these to you because we'll be here all day, but I will give you a link to check out if you're interested. So the PRC views these three communiques as the political foundation for the US PRC relationship and regularly tries to conflate these three communiques with its own One China principle, or portray the United States as having agreed to the PRC's view, which, for what it's worth, the United States voted no on UN General Assembly Resolution 2758. So for the United States, the three communiques are only one part of its One China policy, which also includes the Taiwan Relations Act, enacted in 1979 and is worth looking for. I'll give you a link to it. And then the part I mentioned earlier, the six assurances. So the six assurances, about a month before the 1982 joint communique was released, US policymakers wanted to assure Taiwan, six assurances, about what was in it. So basically reassuring Taipei that they weren't about to be sold up the river to Beijing by Washington. So on July 14th, 1942 would be a bit early, James Lilly, who's the director of the American Institute in Taiwan, which is what the United States uses in Taipei instead of an embassy, which we would have if we recognize Taiwan as an independent state. So instead, we have the American Institute in Taiwan. And James Lilly delivered a list of talking points to Taiwan's president, Chiang Ching Kuo. Those talking points would later come to be known as the Six Assurances. Taiwan would shortly request U.S. permission to make those public, and the U.S. agreed, delivering a version for public release about 1 month later. Interestingly enough, one of the big changes there was they removed any reference to President Reagan having passed off on those six assurances. Um, Now, there will be a link in the show notes for the six assurances, but we can run through them real quick and dirty approach. So, six assurances. Number one, the United States did not agree to set a date for ending arms sales to Taiwan, which continue today. The United States has not agreed to consult with the PRC on arms sales to Taiwan. So, we deal economically and in terms of military assistance with Taiwan on a one-to-one basis without Beijing in the loop. The United States will not play any mediation role between Taipei and Beijing. The United States has not agreed to revise the Taiwan Relations Act. The United States has not altered its position regarding sovereignty over Taiwan, and the US side will not exert pressure on Taiwan to enter into negotiations with the PRC. So there you have it. Um, Once over the world on US, China, and Taiwan, the one China policy versus the one China principle. It's a very important distinction, but one that routinely gets missed out in the news and sometimes by policymakers. So I thought you'd find it interesting. That's it for my first video. I know this probably would have been a lot more helpful if I'd done it before Thanksgiving, so you could have this in your back pocket for drunken conversations with your uncle at the table. But such is life; I didn't get it done, so apologies. If you did enjoy this, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what kind of foreign policy questions you want to hear more about in the future. Thanks. See ya.